Hello, midnight wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This happened when I was around 22 years old, sometime in late February or early March of 2015. Even though more than a decade has passed, I can still remember every detail of that night with uncomfortable clarity. It wasn't a supernatural experience, and nothing overtly happened to me. But it remains one of the most terrifying moments of my life because of a feeling I still can't fully explain. I've always believed that people should trust their instincts. At the time, though, I didn't really understand just how powerful those instincts could be. Looking back now, I think that night taught me something important about listening to that inner voice when it tells you something isn't right. I had just finished work and was making my usual trip home. Like most evenings, I took the bus and got off at my regular stop. It was already dark outside, and winter still hadn't completely let go. There were patches of old snow scattered around, especially in shaded areas where the sun hadn't reached. The air was cold enough that every breath came out in visible clouds. The route home was one I knew extremely well. To save time, I usually cut through a park that connected several neighborhoods. There was a walking path that ran through a large open field before leading toward my apartment. I had walked that route countless times before and never had any problems. The layout of the area is a little difficult to explain, but imagine a large walking path shaped somewhat like the letter F. One section extended farther than the others, while another branch angled downward into a wider open area. The path wound through open grass, scattered trees, and small sections of brush before eventually reaching an exit near residential streets. I knew every turn, every shortcut, every landmark. It was familiar enough that I could practically walk it with my eyes closed. That evening felt completely normal at first. I got off the bus and headed toward the entrance to the park. The streets were relatively quiet, and there weren't many people around. It was the kind of cold night where most people preferred staying indoors. As I approached the gate leading into the park, I remember feeling tired from work, but otherwise perfectly fine. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing felt wrong. At least not yet. I stepped through the entrance and turned the corner onto the path. The moment my foot landed on a patch of snow, it made a loud crunching sound. That single sound changed everything. The noise echoed through the otherwise quiet park. Immediately afterward, I noticed a truck parked farther up the path. At first, I wasn't particularly concerned. Vehicles occasionally entered certain parts of the park for maintenance or other legitimate reasons. But then, I saw the people. There were several men gathered around the truck. I couldn't tell exactly how many at first, but I would estimate 4 or 5. They seemed to be standing around the vehicle doing something. To this day, I still don't know what. What I do remember is what happened next. The second the snow crunched beneath my feet, every one of them stopped what they were doing. Every single one. Then, they all turned and looked directly at me. The suddenness of it immediately sent a chill through my body. It wasn't just that they noticed me. It was how quickly and completely their attention shifted. One moment they were occupied with whatever they had been doing. The next moment they were all staring at me. I froze for half a second. Then I noticed something else. They had a large industrial-style work light set up near the truck. Without hesitation, they aimed it directly at me. The bright beam cut through the darkness and locked onto me. Suddenly, I was standing in the middle of a dark park under a spotlight. I couldn't see their faces clearly anymore because the light was shining directly into my eyes. But I knew they could see me perfectly. That was the moment fear began creeping in. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were workers. Maybe they were fixing something. Maybe they were simply curious about who was approaching. But despite all the logical explanations I tried to create, something deep inside me reacted differently. Every instinct I had was screaming, not whispering, not suggesting, screaming. The message was immediate and overwhelming. Do not run. For some reason, that thought repeated over and over in my mind. Don't run. Don't panic. Don't show fear. Just keep walking. To this day, I can't explain why that specific feeling was so strong. I wasn't consciously thinking that the men would chase me. I wasn't imagining scenarios. Yet every part of me seemed convinced that running would be the worst possible thing I could do. So, I kept walking. The beam of light followed me the entire time. Every step I took felt painfully slow. The path suddenly seemed much longer than it ever had before. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Trying to calm myself, I pulled out my phone. I called my boyfriend. No answer. I called again, still nothing. Then I tried texting him. No response. The silence made my anxiety worse. I decided to call my roommate. Again, no answer. At that point, I felt completely alone. Home was only about a 5-minute walk away, but it might as well have been miles. I desperately wanted someone on the phone. Someone who could hear what was happening. Someone who could stay connected until I reached safety. But nobody answered. I was forced to continue walking by myself. The men remained near the truck. The light remained fixed on me. Then one of them started moving. I noticed him separate from the group. Slowly, he began walking along the path, toward the exit, toward the same place I was heading. The sight of him moving immediately sent another wave of panic through me. I tried to remain calm. I kept walking. I told myself that maybe he was simply going somewhere. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting, but the feeling in my gut continued growing stronger. Every survival instinct I possessed seemed fully activated. The distance between me and the exit felt endless. I kept checking my phone. Still no replies, still no calls back. The man continued walking, not directly toward me, just toward the exit, toward the only way out. At that point, I remember feeling trapped. Not physically trapped, psychologically trapped. I didn't want to turn around and go back. I didn't want to run. All I could do was continue forward and hope my instincts were wrong. Finally, I reached the exit. I walked through it without changing pace. I didn't look back immediately. I just kept moving. Then, after passing a cluster of bushes near the entrance, I glanced over my shoulder. What I saw is the image that has stayed with me all these years. The man who had been walking toward the exit had stopped. He wasn't following me. Instead, he had turned around. Even from a distance, I could see him make a shrugging motion toward the group near the truck. Almost as if he was communicating something. Almost as if he were reporting back. The moment I saw that gesture, every remaining ounce of self-control disappeared. I ran. I sprinted. I didn't care anymore whether running was a bad idea. I just wanted to get home. The cold air burned in my lungs as I raced through the streets. My heart pounded harder with every step. By the time I reached my apartment, I was on the verge of tears. I rushed inside and immediately locked the door. My hands were shaking. My breathing was uneven. I felt overwhelmed by a level of fear I had never experienced before. When my boyfriend and roommate finally saw me, they were confused. I tried explaining what had happened. I told them about the truck, the men, the spotlight, the feeling, the man walking toward the exit, the shrug, everything, but they didn't really understand. To them, nothing had actually happened. Nobody had threatened me. Nobody had spoken to me. Nobody had chased me. From their perspective, it sounded like I had simply scared myself. I understand why they felt that way. Looking at the story objectively, there wasn't any clear evidence that those men intended harm. Maybe they were workers. Maybe they were security personnel. Maybe they were doing something completely innocent. The truth is, I don't know. What I do know is how I felt. And I have never felt that way before, or since. There was something about that situation that triggered every alarm bell in my body. A primal warning that seemed to bypass logic completely. For years, I tried not to think about it. Then one day, more than a decade later, a realization hit me. I probably should have called the police. At the time, I was so focused on getting home safely that it never even crossed my mind. But looking back, a group of men parked in a dark park at night, shining an industrial light on a lone woman and tracking her movements was absolutely unusual behavior. Whether they were doing something illegal or not, it was worth reporting. Of course, by then it was far too late. Nothing could be done. The moment had long passed. Even so, the memory remains vivid. Not because of what happened, but because of what almost felt like it could have happened. Sometimes fear comes from a visible threat. Other times it comes from a feeling so powerful that it overrides reason. That night, I learned just how loud human instincts can become when they believe danger is near. I still don't know who those men were. I still don't know why they focused on me, and I still don't know what the shrug meant. But after all these years, I haven't forgotten a single second of it. And I don't think I ever will. I've had two experiences in my life that still give me chills whenever I think about them. One happened recently. The other happened when I was a kid. To this day, I can't fully explain either one. The recent one happened literally just moments before I started writing this. It was late at night. The kind of night where everything outside is completely black. No people walking around. No traffic, just darkness. I was sitting at my desk browsing Reddit and wasting time before bed. My window was open because the air outside was cooler than inside the house. Everything was quiet. Normal, peaceful, then, completely out of nowhere, I heard a voice. Not from my computer, not from my phone, not from inside the house. It came from the other side of the window screen. A deep, raspy voice. The kind of voice that instantly makes every muscle in your body tense. And all it said was, "Hey fella, that's it." 2 words. But I've never moved so fast in my life. 1 second I was comfortably sitting at my desk. The next I was halfway out of my chair. My heart practically launched itself into my throat. I slammed the window shut immediately. No hesitation, no investigation, no curiosity, just pure instinct. Close the window. Now, I didn't look outside. I didn't answer. I didn't ask who was there. I've never been the kind of person who answers the door for strangers, and I'm definitely not the kind of person who answers a voice coming from a dark window at night. For all I know, it was someone playing a prank. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe some random person passing by. Maybe someone who genuinely needed something. I have no idea. And honestly, I don't really want to know. As I'm writing this, I still don't know who it was. For all I know, they could still be standing out there. But they're not getting a response from me. The older story is the one that really stuck with me, though, because that happened decades ago, and I still remember every second of it. When I was a kid, my family lived in a house with a basement that terrified me. I couldn't even explain why. Nothing bad had ever happened down there. No scary stories. No strange incidents. Yet every time I looked down those stairs, I felt uneasy. It was one of those irrational childhood fears that made absolutely no sense. The basement wasn't even particularly unusual. It was just old, dark, quiet, and creepy. One day my entire family was outside near the far end of the yard. I was playing outside too when I suddenly remembered a toy I'd left in the basement. Naturally, I wanted it. Unfortunately, nobody wanted to go get it for me. I begged. I complained. I tried convincing everyone else to do it. No luck. Eventually, I realized I was going to have to get it myself. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairs trying to build up courage. Then I came up with a strategy. I started repeating a phrase to myself, over and over, like a protective spell. There's no such thing as ghosts. I said it once. Then again. And again, with every step downward. There's no such thing as ghosts. The stairs creaked beneath my feet. There's no such thing as ghosts. The basement seemed darker than usual. There's no such thing as ghosts. By the time I reached the bottom, I was practically chanting it. I rounded the corner and headed toward a large walk-in closet located at the far end of the basement. Of course, my toy wasn't sitting near the front. That would have been too easy. It was all the way in the back. I kept repeating the phrase. Louder, now, trying to convince myself. Trying to drown out the fear. I stepped into the closet, reached toward the back, found the toy. Victory. At that exact moment, I grabbed the hanging light cord. Feeling incredibly brave, I practically shouted, "There's no such thing as ghosts." Then, I pulled the light. And that's when I heard it. A laugh. Not a normal laugh. Not a person laughing upstairs. Not a television. Not a family member. The deepest, strangest laugh I have ever heard in my entire life. It sounded wrong. Almost inhuman. Like something enormous finding me amusing. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The instant I heard it, every bit of courage disappeared. Pure terror flooded through me. I've never experienced fear like that before or since. For a moment, I genuinely thought I might pass out. Then, survival instinct took over. I ran. And when I say ran, I mean cartoon character levels of running. My feet were moving before my brain had even caught up. I exploded out of that closet, up the basement stairs, through the house, out the back door, straight toward my family. I don't remember stopping. I don't remember breathing. I just remember absolute panic. When I finally reached everyone, I was screaming about what I'd heard. Naturally, nobody believed me. My parents assumed I had scared myself. Maybe imagined something. Maybe heard a pipe creak. Maybe heard an echo. Anything but what I thought I'd heard. The only person who seemed willing to take me seriously was my grandmother. I still remember overhearing her talking to my parents afterward. She quietly said, "I told you something was in that basement." That sentence did absolutely nothing to help. If anything, it made the whole experience 10 times worse. Because now, the one person who believed me also seemed convinced the basement wasn't normal. After that day, I never went into that basement alone again. Honestly, I avoided it whenever possible. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe the laugh came from outside. Maybe it was some strange noise that my terrified childhood brain interpreted incorrectly. That's probably the most logical answer. But even now, all these years later, I can still hear that sound in my memory. And every time I do, I feel the same chill run down my spine. I still don't know who said, "Hey fella," outside my window tonight, and I still don't know what laughed in that basement all those years ago. Maybe both have perfectly ordinary explanations. Or maybe some things are better left unexplained. Either way, I have no intention of opening that window to find out. This happened to me personally. Compared to some of the truly horrifying stories people tell, it probably isn't the scariest thing in the world. Nobody died. Nobody got hurt. And maybe there are perfectly rational explanations for everything that happened. But it still freaks me out to this day. A few years ago, my family and I took a vacation to California over New Year's. Part of the trip included spending a couple of nights aboard the Queen Mary. At the time, I knew almost nothing about the ship. I knew it was old. I knew it was famous. And I knew it had been converted into a hotel. That was about it. What I didn't know was that the Queen Mary has a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in America. People talk about ghosts there constantly. There are guided tours centered entirely around paranormal stories. Certain rooms have become famous among ghost hunters. Entire sections of the ship are supposedly hotspots for strange experiences. I knew none of that when we checked in. Looking back, maybe that's what makes the story feel stranger. I wasn't looking for ghosts. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I didn't even know I was staying near one of the ship's most infamous rooms, B340. Our room was split into two sections connected by a door. After we arrived around noon, I went into my side of the room and started unpacking my luggage. Nothing unusual, just the normal routine of settling into a hotel. I put my bags down, started hanging up clothes, looked around the room. At one point, I was standing near the center of the room examining a shirt I'd packed. As I started walking toward the bed, something touched my leg. Not brushed against my pants, not the sensation of fabric moving. Something touched me, specifically my right leg. I immediately looked down. Nothing, no object, no person, no animal, nothing at all. For a second, I just stood there staring, trying to understand what I'd felt. The closest comparison I've ever been able to come up with is a cat rubbing itself against your leg. Anyone who's owned a cat knows the feeling. That gentle pressure as they brush past you. That's exactly what it felt like. Except there wasn't a cat. There wasn't anything. The experience only lasted a second or two, and eventually I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe my clothes shifted. Maybe it was one of those weird sensations the brain creates occasionally. So I shrugged it off and moved on. The following day, my family joined one of the guided tours of the ship. The guide spent hours talking about the history of the Queen Mary, the ship's construction, its military service, the people who had lived and worked aboard it. Eventually, we made our way up to one of the upper decks. That's when the guide mentioned something interesting. Back when the ship was operational, cats had lived aboard to help control the rat population. Apparently, they were common throughout various parts of the vessel. Then the guide casually added something that made my stomach tighten. He said that one of the more frequently reported paranormal experiences involved people feeling what seemed like cats brushing against their legs. Some guests even claimed to hear meowing when no animals were present. I remember standing there, completely still, because I hadn't told anyone about what happened in my room, and until that moment, I hadn't connected it to anything. Maybe it was a coincidence. Probably it was. But hearing those exact words less than 24 hours after feeling something brush against my leg definitely got my attention. Still, that wasn't the experience that truly scared me. That came later. Much later. After the tour, we spent the rest of the evening exploring the ship. The Queen Mary is enormous, and at night it feels very different from a modern hotel. Long corridors, dim lighting, a constant sense that you're walking through a piece of history. By the time I returned to my room, it was around 3 in the morning. The ship was quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. I remember opening the door and heading inside. I was exhausted. All I wanted was sleep. As I crossed the room, I was looking down at the floor, half asleep already. Then, something happened. Out of nowhere, a chill ran through me. Not because the room was cold. It wasn't. The sensation was sudden and intense. The kind of chill that makes every hair on your body stand up. Instinctively, I looked up. My eyes landed on the far corner of the room, specifically the corner of my bed, and that's when I saw it. Sitting on the edge of the mattress was what looked like a human-sized gray cloud. Not a person, not a shadow, not smoke, just a shape. A vaguely human-sized mass of gray sitting there in the darkness. For a split second, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. I remember staring at it, trying to understand it, trying to make it become something ordinary, a pile of blankets, a trick of the light. Anything, then realization hit. And every ounce of courage immediately abandoned me. I spun around and ran. I don't mean I walked quickly. I ran. Straight out of the room. Straight to my dad's room. I was so terrified that I started laughing hysterically. That strange kind of laughter people sometimes get when they're completely overwhelmed by fear. I must have looked insane. I burst into his room and tried explaining what I'd just seen. To his credit, he didn't dismiss me. Instead, he got up and walked back with me. Together, we entered the room. I pointed toward the corner of the bed. Nothing was there. The room looked completely normal. No gray shape, no shadow figure, nothing. Just a bed in the corner of a room. Exactly as it should have been. My dad looked around, found nothing unusual, and eventually went back to bed. I, however, did not. At least not easily. Every shadow suddenly looked suspicious. Every sound made me jump. I spent the rest of the night replaying what I'd seen over and over in my head, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the lighting created some weird illusion. Maybe my brain filled in details that weren't actually there. Those explanations make sense. Probably more sense than anything paranormal. But the problem is that the image remains crystal clear in my memory. I can still picture exactly where it was sitting, exactly what it looked like, exactly how I felt when I saw it. And that's what makes the experience so unsettling. Not because I'm convinced I saw a ghost, but because it felt real. Very real. Maybe the Queen Mary is haunted. Maybe it isn't. Maybe I experienced nothing more than coincidence, exhaustion, and an overactive imagination. Or maybe I spent 2 nights sharing a room with something I couldn't explain. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. I didn't sleep very well for the rest of that trip. This happened about 20 years ago when I lived in Phoenix. Back then, one of my favorite things to do was take random day trips into the mountains. No real plan. Just pick a direction, grab a friend, and see what we could find. Arizona is full of places like that. Old roads, hidden trails, abandoned sites, waterfalls tucked away in canyons. Half the fun was simply exploring. One day, near the end of fire season, a friend and I headed north toward the mountains around Pine and Strawberry. At least I think that's where it was. We'd heard about some waterfalls and decided to spend the day looking for them. The drive was beautiful. Tall pines, cooler air, the kind of scenery that makes you forget you're only a couple of hours from the desert. Eventually, we reached a section of road that had been closed. There had apparently been a wildfire in the area not long before. The road barrier was up and no vehicles were allowed through. Since we weren't in any hurry, we pulled over. The plan was simple: stretch our legs, walk a little, see what was ahead, then head back. The road beyond the closure had turned into dirt. It followed the edge of a steep cliff, but was surprisingly wide. 3 lanes across in some places. At first, it seemed perfectly harmless. Then we noticed something. Leaning against a signpost beside the road was a deer leg. Inside a shoe, an actual deer leg, wearing a shoe. To this day, I have no explanation for it. It was one of those things that's instantly unsettling. Not because it was dangerous, because it made absolutely no sense. I remember stopping and staring at it. My immediate reaction was that maybe we'd seen enough, maybe it was time to turn around. My friend disagreed. He laughed and hit me with, "Where's your sense of adventure?" Fair point. So we kept walking. A few minutes later, we passed a sign. It read, "Drive 5 and stay alive." We laughed. It sounded ridiculous, a little dramatic. Who puts up a sign like that? Then we passed another one. Same message. Drive 5 and stay alive. Then another, and another. The farther we walked, the less funny the signs became. The road surface was loose sand and gravel. Even on foot, you could tell traction would be terrible. A vehicle going too fast wouldn't have much room for error. I found myself becoming increasingly glad the road was closed. The atmosphere started feeling strange. Not supernatural, just unsettling. The kind of place where your instincts quietly tell you something is wrong. We kept walking, maybe half an hour, maybe less. Neither of us was paying much attention to time. Eventually, we noticed something ahead. The road appeared to end, which didn't make any sense. According to the map, this road was supposed to continue eventually towards Sedona. There shouldn't have been a dead end. As we got closer, we saw another sign. Drive 5 and stay alive. By this point, we weren't laughing anymore. We reached what looked like the end of the road. Then we realized it wasn't a dead end at all. The road simply made an incredibly sharp turn, almost a 45-degree angle to the left. The wide roadway suddenly narrowed to a single lane, and directly beyond it was empty space. A steep drop into a deep ravine hundreds of feet below. Suddenly, everything clicked. A driver approaching too quickly would see what appeared to be a straight road, hit the brakes, lose traction, and slide right off the edge. The signs weren't exaggerations, they were warnings, very serious warnings. The whole place felt different after that realization. We stood there quietly for a while. The view itself was beautiful, mountains stretching into the distance, trees everywhere. Exactly the sort of landscape people drive hours to see. I walked closer to the edge and looked down into the ravine. At first I thought I was seeing a dumping ground. Large objects were scattered all over the bottom. Dark shapes, metal, debris. The farther I looked, the stranger it seemed. I couldn't identify anything. There were tires visible, pipes, random pieces of metal. But nothing made sense. Then my brain finally put the pieces together. The tires weren't separate. They were attached to something. Cars, the objects below weren't junk. They were vehicles, dozens of them. Or at least it felt like dozens. All upside down, all crumpled, all scattered across the ravine floor. Some looked ancient, others looked newer. One in particular appeared disturbingly recent. The realization hit both of us at once. Every one of those vehicles represented a person, a family, a driver, a passenger, someone who had come around that corner too fast, someone who had ignored the signs, or someone who simply made one mistake. We just stood there, staring, completely horrified. The signs suddenly felt less like road safety warnings and more like gravestones. Then we noticed one final sign near the edge. Unlike the others, it looked brand new. We walked over and read it. It wasn't a traffic sign. It was a memorial. It described a fatal accident that had happened only weeks earlier. Someone had died there the month before. Standing in that spot suddenly felt surreal. We hadn't set out looking for tragedy. We'd been searching for waterfalls, adventure, scenery. Instead, we'd accidentally stumbled upon a place where people had been dying for years. A place where the evidence was still lying at the bottom of the ravine for anyone willing to look. Neither of us felt much like exploring anymore. The excitement was gone. The curiosity was gone. All that remained was a strange mix of sadness and unease. We turned around and walked back the way we came, past the memorial, past the warning signs, past the deer leg in the shoe. The entire hike back felt different. Quieter, neither of us had much to say. Even after we got back into the car, the mood never really recovered. For the rest of the day, we kept asking each other the same question. Did that really happen? Because it felt like one of those strange experiences that doesn't quite seem real afterward. Like something from a movie. A bizarre sequence of increasingly unsettling discoveries leading to a cliff full of wrecked cars and a fresh memorial for someone who had died there only weeks before. We never did find the waterfalls. And honestly, by then, neither of us cared anymore. Some places leave an impression on you for their beauty. Others leave an impression because they remind you how quickly life can end. That road managed to do both. This happened when I was 13 years old. Even now, decades later, my younger brother and I still remember it. We've talked about it a few times over the years, but not often. Especially not him. Whatever happened that day left a mark on both of us. To understand the story, you need to understand the basement. Every family seems to have that one room in the house that nobody likes. For us, it was the basement. It wasn't unfinished or abandoned. It was technically part of the house. But it always felt wrong somehow. The furniture was old. The lighting was poor. The air always seemed colder than the rest of the house. Even during the daytime, it felt like a place where shadows lingered longer than they should. There were several rooms down there, including one that my aunt used to spend a lot of time in years before. As kids, we never liked being alone in that basement. You couldn't point to anything specific. It just had an atmosphere. The kind of place where you suddenly feel the need to look over your shoulder for no reason. One morning, when I was 13, I woke up feeling sick. Not terribly sick, just sick enough that I desperately didn't want to go to school. My 11-year-old brother wasn't feeling great either. After enough begging, our mom finally agreed to let us stay home. There was just one problem. Our stepdad wasn't exactly a fan of mental health days. If he thought we were skipping school without a serious reason, we'd never hear the end of it. So my mom came up with a plan. We would stay downstairs in the basement until he left for work. Then we'd be free to come back upstairs. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Neither of us was thrilled about spending the morning in the basement, but it seemed better than going to school. So, we grabbed some blankets and headed down. We settled into the room where my aunt used to hang out. The plan was simple: sleep until our stepdad left, then go upstairs and enjoy our unexpected day off. I fell asleep fairly quickly. My brother didn't. At some point later, I was violently pulled out of sleep by screaming, not shouting, not calling my name. Screaming, the kind of scream that instantly floods your body with adrenaline. I sat upright, completely disoriented. My brother was staring toward the doorway, terrified, absolutely terrified. He kept yelling at me to close the door. Close the door. Close the door. Over and over. I demanded to know what was wrong. His answer didn't help. According to him, he'd seen something in the basement bathroom. Something large, something covered in fur. He described it as looking almost like a giant cat standing upright like a person. A human-shaped cat. At 13, I immediately assumed he was imagining things. He'd just woken up. The basement was creepy. His mind was playing tricks on him. At least that's what I wanted to believe. Then I heard it. A scratching sound. Soft at first, almost faint, coming from somewhere outside the room. I froze. The scratching continued, slowly moving along the wall, getting closer. My brother immediately started crying. I remember feeling my stomach drop, because whatever the noise was, it was real. We were both hearing it. The scratching traveled closer and closer. Then it stopped. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then came the knocking. Light, slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, scratch. A pause. Knock, knock, scratch. Again. Knock, knock, scratch. It wasn't the kind of knocking someone uses when they want your attention. It sounded almost experimental, like something trying to figure out the door, or trying to imitate knocking without fully understanding it. Even writing that makes me uncomfortable. At the time, it terrified us. We sat completely frozen, listening, waiting, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The pattern continued. Knock, knock, scratch. My brother kept describing the thing he'd seen. The fur, the size, the way it supposedly jumped off the dryer, the way it seemed to be coming toward us. The more he talked, the more frightened I became. Not because I necessarily believed him, but because I couldn't explain the noises. If it had only been his story, I could dismiss it. If it had only been the scratching, maybe it was a mouse. If it had only been the knocking, maybe a pipe. But all of it happening together in that basement felt overwhelming. I started crying, not quietly. I was terrified. I remember standing on furniture and banging on the ceiling as hard as I could, trying to get my mom's attention upstairs. The knocking became louder, harder, more forceful. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything seemed to settle. Eventually, the fear became exhausting. There wasn't really anything we could do. Neither of us was brave enough to open the door. Neither of us wanted to investigate. So we stayed where we were, trying to ignore it, trying to convince ourselves it would be okay. At some point, I must have drifted back to sleep, or at least into that strange half-asleep state children sometimes enter when they're exhausted from being scared. Around 12:30 that afternoon, our mom finally came downstairs. The moment the door opened, we practically launched ourselves out of the room. We didn't stop to explain. We didn't stop to investigate. We just wanted out. Out of the basement. Out of that room. Out of whatever atmosphere had settled over the place that morning. Years have passed since then. A lot of years. We've both grown up. We've both experienced far scarier things in life than a strange morning in a basement. Yet somehow, this story remains. Whenever it comes up, my brother still gets visibly uncomfortable. He doesn't like talking about it. Neither do I, if I'm being honest. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe he saw an animal. Maybe the scratching came from old pipes or shifting wood. Maybe our imaginations fed off each other until everything felt bigger and scarier than it really was. That's probably the most reasonable explanation. But here's the thing. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear that pattern in my head. Knock, knock, scratch, knock, knock, scratch, and every time I remember it, I find myself feeling exactly the way I did at 13 years old. Sitting in a cold basement, listening to something moving closer and desperately hoping the door would stay closed. This happened when I was around 11 years old. Even now, years later, it's one of the few memories that can still make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At the time, my family had just moved into a new house. There were 6 of us, and before that, we'd all been crammed into a tiny one-bedroom home. The new place felt enormous by comparison. 3 bedrooms, a backyard, enough space that everyone wasn't constantly on top of each other. For the first month or 2, everything was completely normal. No strange noises, no weird neighbors, no creepy stories, just a family settling into a new house. My bedroom was positioned in a way that gave me a direct view toward the backyard. My mom had hung up these thin, lacy white curtains over the window. They weren't exactly blackout curtains. At night, you could still see shapes and shadows through them. Normally, that would have terrified me because I was scared of the dark as a kid. But our dog slept right by the back door every night, and she was extremely protective. Knowing she was there always made me feel safer. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I woke up. Or maybe I'd never fully fallen asleep. I honestly can't remember. What I do remember is lying in bed facing the wall. The house was completely dark, completely quiet, except for the sounds of my family sleeping. I could hear my sister snoring softly from the other side of the room. I could hear my dad's much louder snoring coming from down the hall. All the bedroom doors were open, as they usually were. And because of the way the house was built, I knew something important. If anyone walked into my room, I'd hear it. The floors creaked. Badly, there was one particular section of floor outside my room that absolutely could not be crossed quietly. You stepped there, everybody knew. So I wasn't worried about anyone sneaking up on me. Then, something strange happened. Out of nowhere, I got this overwhelming feeling that I needed to check on my sister. Not curiosity, not concern, an almost desperate urge. I suddenly felt like I needed to get out of bed and hug her, make sure she was okay. The feeling came from nowhere and made no sense. I could hear her breathing. She was asleep. Everything was fine, yet the feeling wouldn't go away. Then my entire body went cold. I don't mean I felt chilly. I mean every muscle seemed to lock up at once. And before I could even process what was happening, I felt something touch my head. A hand, an actual hand, resting gently on the top of my head. To this day, I can still remember exactly what it felt like. It wasn't cold. It wasn't ghostly. It wasn't vague. It was warm. Warm and unmistakably human. The moment it touched me, every ounce of fear in my body exploded. I wanted to scream. I couldn't. I wanted to move. I couldn't. I wanted to turn around and see who was there. I couldn't. I was completely frozen. The hand remained there, just resting on my head. Gently. Almost affectionately, which somehow made it even worse, because it didn't feel violent. It felt familiar, like someone comforting a child, except I knew nobody should have been there. I could still hear my sister sleeping. I could still hear my father snoring. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, no opening door. Nothing. The hand remained there for what felt like forever. Realistically, it was probably only seconds. Maybe a minute, but fear stretches time. Every second felt endless. Then I felt the fingers move. They slowly scratched across my scalp, softly, almost like someone absent-mindedly stroking a child's hair. I thought I was going to start crying, not because it hurt, because I had no idea who or what was touching me. Eventually the hand lifted away, just as gently as it had arrived. And then there was nothing. No footsteps, no sounds, no movement, just silence. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Maybe it actually was an hour, I don't know. Eventually I managed to force myself to move. The moment I could, I got out of bed and crossed the room to my sister. She was asleep, completely normal, completely safe. The second I saw that she was okay, I unexpectedly broke down. I didn't understand why. Maybe because I'd spent all that time terrified something had happened to her. Maybe because the strange urge to protect her had never really left. I quietly went to my parents' room and told them what happened. They listened. Then, they told me it was probably a dream. And honestly, their explanation made sense. The dog hadn't barked. She was incredibly aggressive toward strangers. If someone had entered the house, she would have raised hell. There had been no sounds, no evidence, nothing, so eventually I accepted their explanation. Maybe it had been a nightmare. Maybe I'd experienced sleep paralysis. Maybe I'd imagined it. Over the next week, the memory slowly faded. Life returned to normal. School, homework, family stuff. I stopped thinking about it. Then, one afternoon, I came home from school and saw police cars outside our house. My stomach immediately dropped. My first thought wasn't about myself. It was my sister. I jumped out and ran toward the house. When I saw my parents and all my siblings standing together, I felt immediate relief. Everyone was okay. After things calmed down, I asked what happened. That's when I learned something I never forgot. Our backyard contained an old 2-story shed. The upper level was mostly used for storage. That day, my dad had gone up there looking for some tools. Instead, he found someone. A woman. Apparently, she'd been living inside the shed. She was filthy, thin, frail looking. Nobody knew how long she'd been there. When my father confronted her, she didn't panic. She didn't run. According to him, she simply smiled. Then she said something that still makes my blood run cold. She told him that my sister was very pretty and asked whether he still wanted her. Just like that. As casually as someone commenting on the weather. The police were called immediately. I don't know every detail of what happened afterward. I don't know who she was. I don't know how long she'd been watching the house. And I don't know whether that night in my bedroom had anything to do with her. Maybe it didn't. Maybe the hand was a dream. Maybe it was sleep paralysis. Maybe the timing was just an awful coincidence. But even now, all these years later, I still remember how real that hand felt. I still remember the urge to protect my sister. And I still remember hearing that a stranger had been living only a few yards away from our family, without us knowing. Whether the two events were connected or not, I can't say. But I've never forgotten either of them, and ever since then, I've been obsessive about one thing. Lock your doors. Lock your windows. And never assume you know who might be watching from outside. This story has gotten scarier the older I've gotten. When it happened, I didn't fully understand what was going on. I was only 6 or 7 years old. To me, it just felt like something strange had happened. As an adult looking back, I realize how differently that day could have ended. and that's what makes it so unsettling. At the time, my older sister and I liked going to a nearby school to play soccer. There was a track around the field, plenty of open space, and not much else going on during the day. Sometimes our dad would take us. Other times our older brother would drop us off on his way to work. That particular day, our brother was the one who drove us there. I remember it being winter, around 10 in the morning. The school grounds were mostly empty, just me, my sister, and a lot of open space. At first, everything seemed normal. We walked around the track together, talked, played, the kind of ordinary childhood day that usually fades from memory. Then a man appeared. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Adults were everywhere. Seeing someone at a school wasn't unusual. But looking back, there were details that should have stood out. He was wearing sunglasses, a hat, jeans, nothing particularly strange on their own. But something about him felt out of place. I didn't notice it then. My sister apparently did. The track sat on a hill overlooking the soccer field below. Eventually, my sister headed down toward the field and I followed her. I was excited to play, completely focused on soccer, completely unaware of anything else. After a while, though, I noticed my sister acting differently. She kept pulling out her flip phone, looking around, trying to make calls. At the time, I assumed she was just talking to someone. I didn't understand why she seemed so tense. I was still in my own little world. At one point, I climbed up onto the referee stand overlooking the field. I thought it was cool. It gave me a better view. I was sitting up there when my sister suddenly yelled at me. Not casually, not jokingly. Angrily, "Get down." I remember being confused. Why was she so upset? Then I looked up, and I saw him, the same man from the track. He had followed us, all the way from the track, all the way down to the soccer field. Even as a child, something clicked in my head. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. I climbed down immediately. That's when I realized my sister wasn't casually using her phone. She was desperately trying to reach our brother. He worked only a short distance away. While I had been focused on soccer, she had apparently been watching this man the entire time. Watching him follow us, watching him stay near us, watching him move whenever we moved. She knew something was wrong long before I did. The moment she got through to our brother, everything changed. She grabbed me hard and told me to stay in front of her. We started moving quickly toward the edge of the field. The plan was simple: get out. Now, unfortunately, there was a problem. A fence blocked our path, and the gate was chained shut. I still remember the panic in my sister's voice, the urgency, the fear. She wasn't acting like an annoyed older sibling anymore. She was acting like someone trying to protect a child, because that's exactly what she was doing. The gate wasn't supposed to open, but somehow she forced enough space for me to squeeze through. Then she told me to run. At that point, I remember seeing the man moving toward us. Faster, close enough now that there was no doubt. He wasn't just walking through the area. He was following us. I squeezed through the opening, then turned around and held it open for my sister. She started climbing through after me. And then something happened that perfectly captures how little kids think. Her soccer ball fell, and without hesitation, I went back for it. To me, the ball mattered. I didn't fully understand the danger. I just didn't want to leave it behind. My sister absolutely lost her mind. She started screaming my name. Terrified, I can still hear it in my head. That wasn't anger. That was pure fear. Thankfully, I grabbed the ball and came back through the opening. And then, almost like something out of a movie, our brother arrived. His car came flying into view. I remember doors opening, my sister practically shoving me toward the vehicle. I jumped inside so fast I smacked my head. The moment we were both in, my brother hit the gas. We were gone. The rest of the memory is blurry. I remember my brother swearing, a lot. I remember my sister being shaken up. I remember feeling confused. I knew something bad had happened. I just didn't understand how bad. For years, nobody really talked about it. In fact, I was told not to mention it. So I didn't. Life moved on. The memory slowly faded into the background. Then I got old enough to understand. Old enough to recognize what my sister had probably seen long before I did. A grown man following two children. A man who kept appearing wherever they went. A man who continued following even after they changed locations. A man who chased them when they tried to leave. As an adult, those details hit very differently. And that's the part that stays with me now. Not the chase. Not the fence. Not even the fear. It's the realization that my sister saved me. At an age when she should have just been worrying about soccer and school, she recognized danger and acted immediately. She called for help. She got us moving. She got us out. And because of that, I'm here telling this story instead of becoming one. Sometimes I think about all the missing person posters I've seen over the years. The stories on the news. The children who never made it home. And every once in a while I wonder how close we came. What if my sister hadn't noticed? What if she ignored her instincts? What if our brother hadn't been nearby? What if we'd stayed a little longer? Those questions don't have answers. But they don't need them. The fact that I can ask them at all is unsettling enough. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about what happened. They're about what almost happened. And looking back now, I honestly think my sister may have saved both of our lives that day. This happened when I was a teenager. To this day, I still can't explain the feeling we had that night. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe our brains noticed something before we consciously did. Whatever it was, I've never felt anything quite like it since. I was staying at my friend George's house for the week. Like a lot of teenagers, we thought sneaking out at night was a great idea. We had electric bikes and decided to ride around after everyone had gone to sleep. Nothing unusual, just two kids looking for something to do. At some point, we ended up at the local high school, where a few other kids were hanging around. We spent a while there talking, messing around, and wasting time. Eventually, we realized we needed to get back. The problem was that our bike batteries had died. Completely, so now we had to walk. Normally, that wouldn't have been a big deal. But George's dad had an early work meeting at 6 in the morning, and if we weren't back before he woke up, we'd be caught immediately. It was already around 5. We needed the fastest route home. That route went through an alleyway. During the day, it wasn't a place anyone worried about. People walked through it all the time. I'd been there before. George had too. The difference was that neither of us had ever gone through it at that hour. Not in complete darkness. Not when the entire neighborhood felt asleep. We entered the alley, and immediately something felt strange. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not normal silence, the kind of silence that makes you aware of itself. This was South Philly. Even late at night, there was usually something. A car, a dog barking, people talking somewhere in the distance, a television through an open window. Something. That night there was nothing. No cars, no birds, no voices, no movement, no signs of life whatsoever. The whole area felt empty, almost abandoned. As we walked deeper into the alley, I suddenly felt something I still struggle to describe. The best way I can explain it is that my entire body went on alert at once. My head started tingling. Not pain, not dizziness, just a sudden overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't me convincing myself to be scared. The fear arrived first, instantly, like a switch being flipped. I turned to George, and before I could even fully explain what I was feeling, I asked, "You feel that too?" His answer came immediately. Yeah. That was all I needed to hear. The fact that he felt it too made it infinitely worse. Because now, it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever was happening, we were both experiencing it. Without another word, we started running. Not jogging, not speed walking, running as fast as we could. I remember looking over my shoulder multiple times. Nothing was there. No person, no animal, no obvious threat. Yet every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away. So we did. We sprinted all the way back to his house and made it inside safely. For the rest of the morning, we talked about how weird it felt. Neither of us had an explanation. Eventually, we convinced ourselves we were probably overreacting. Maybe we got creeped out by the darkness. Maybe it was just one of those things. The next day, we snuck out again. Teenagers aren't always known for making good decisions. This time, we didn't even have the bikes. We'd forgotten to charge them. So once again, we found ourselves approaching the same alley. Part of me didn't want to go through it. But avoiding it would add several minutes to the walk. In the daylight, it seemed ridiculous to be afraid. So, we went. As we approached, we noticed a house near the alley. Not directly in the center of it, but close enough that you'd see it while passing. Something looked wrong. We moved closer. Then we looked through a window and immediately backed away. Blood. There was blood everywhere. On the walls. Across parts of the interior. Visible from where we stood outside. Not a little. A lot. The kind of scene that instantly tells you something terrible happened. We didn't stay to investigate. We ran. Again, only this time we knew why. We called the police. Officers arrived quickly. Then more officers arrived. Then more. Within a short period of time, the area was full of emergency vehicles. Crime scene tape, detectives, investigators, people wearing protective suits going in and out of the house. What had started as a strange feeling in an empty alley had suddenly become a major investigation. We watched from a distance, trying to understand what we were seeing, trying to understand whether the two events were connected. To this day, I don't know. Maybe the crime had happened long before we walked through. Maybe whoever was responsible was already gone. Maybe there was absolutely no connection between what we felt that night and what was discovered the next day. Logically, that's probably the most likely explanation. But what sticks with me is the timing. The overwhelming feeling. The fact that both of us felt it simultaneously. The complete silence of the neighborhood. The instinctive urge to run, and then, less than 24 hours later, discovering evidence that something terrible had happened nearby. I've spent years thinking about it. Maybe our brains picked up on something our conscious minds missed. Maybe there were subtle clues in the environment. Maybe there was an odor, a sound, something we noticed without realizing it. Or maybe it really was just coincidence. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've never experienced that feeling before or since. That sudden, overwhelming certainty that I shouldn't be somewhere. The kind of fear that arrives before you know why you're afraid. And every now and then, when I think back on that alley, I still wonder what exactly it was that made us run. I was working on a construction site back then, doing regular labor work like most of the guys around me. The days were usually loud, dusty, and tiring. There was always the sound of machines running, metal hitting metal, workers shouting instructions, and tools being used all the time. It was the kind of place where everyone was focused on getting the job done as fast and safely as possible. But at the same time, small routines and habits slowly became part of the daily life there. One of those small things was a black cat that used to come around the site almost every day. Nobody really knew where it came from at first, but after a while, it just became part of the place. It would appear near the edges of the site, usually around lunchtime or when things got a bit quieter. Some of the workers started feeding it scraps of food without really thinking too much about it. Leftover bread, bits of meat, anything they had in their lunchboxes that they didn't finish. Because of that, the cat kept coming back, again and again. It started to feel like it belonged there in a strange way. Most of us didn't mind it. In fact, some people liked seeing it because it broke the stress of the workday. When things got exhausting, watching the cat walk around slowly or sit in the shade made the place feel a bit more normal, almost peaceful for a moment. But there was one guy on the site who was completely different. He didn't like animals at all, especially cats. He would say they were dirty and annoying, and he never wanted it anywhere near him. Every time he saw the black cat, his mood would change immediately. He would shout at it, stomp his feet, or throw small objects near it just to scare it away. Sometimes he even tried to kick it if it got too close, although the cat was usually quick enough to stay out of reach. Most of us didn't agree with how he behaved, but nobody really made a big issue out of it. People just avoided arguing with him and let things be. The cat, for its part, also learned to stay away from him most of the time, but it still came around the site because of the food other workers gave it. The site had heavy machinery, and one of the main tools we used was an industrial wood chipper. It was a loud, powerful machine used to break down wooden scraps and branches into small pieces. Everyone knew it was dangerous, and there were strict rules about keeping distance and paying attention while using it. Normally, only experienced workers handled it. On the day I remember most clearly, everything was going on as usual. The sun was bright, the air was dry, and the sound of construction filled the area like always. That particular guy who hated cats was working near the wood chipper. He was feeding scraps of wood into it, standing close to the machine as it pulled in and crushed the material. Most people were busy with their own tasks, so not many were paying attention to him at that exact moment. The black cat was somewhere around the site like it usually was, moving quietly between piles of materials and shaded areas. At some point, the cat came closer than usual. It was probably just wandering like it always did, not thinking about anything dangerous. It moved behind the man without him noticing at first. Then, in a sudden moment, it scratched his leg from behind. It wasn't a deep or serious attack, but it was enough to shock him. The man reacted instantly, more out of surprise and fear than anything else. He lost his balance in that split second. The area near the wood chipper was already dangerous because of the moving parts and the noise, and that sudden reaction was all it took. He stumbled forward and fell into the machine's working area before anyone nearby could fully understand what was happening. People reacted immediately, shouting and rushing toward the switch. The machine was shut off quickly, faster than most emergencies like that would usually be handled, but even then, it was already too late. The injuries were extremely severe. There was no way to reverse what had already happened in those few seconds. The site went completely silent for a moment after the machine stopped, like nobody could fully process what they had just seen. Then everything turned into chaos. with people calling for help, shouting for emergency services, and trying to figure out what to do next. The ambulance arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, it was clear that there was nothing they could really do to save him. He passed away shortly after from the injuries and blood loss. It was fast in the end, which at least meant he didn't suffer for long, but the entire situation left everyone shocked and shaken. I still remember the scene very clearly, not in a detailed or graphic way, but more in fragments. The sound of the machine stopping, the sudden silence after so much noise, the way people were standing frozen for a few seconds before reacting, and most of all, the expression on his face in those final moments, which is something that never really left my memory. It stays with me even now, years later, in a way that is hard to explain. That day changed the way I think about how quickly things can go wrong, even during ordinary work. After that incident, the mood on the construction site was never quite the same for a long time. People still worked, still talked, still continued their routines, but there was a different feeling in the air. Everyone became more careful, especially around machinery. Even small mistakes suddenly felt more serious than before. And the black cat, interestingly, still came around for a while, but people reacted differently when they saw it. Some avoided it, some still fed it, but the whole place felt more tense overall. The second memory I have is from when I was just a child, probably around 8 or 9 years old. It is one of those moments that stays in your mind forever, even though you wish you could forget it. I was living in an apartment building at the time, and my friends and I used to play outside in the open area near the building. It was a normal part of our routine. We would run around, talk, play games, and just spend time outside until it got dark, or until our parents called us back inside. It felt safe and normal, like nothing unusual could ever happen there. That day started like any other. The weather was normal, and we were all outside doing what kids usually do. I remember laughing and talking with my friends, completely unaware of anything unusual going on around us. People were coming and going from the building, and everything felt ordinary. Then, suddenly, everything changed in a way that none of us could understand at first. We saw something falling through the air from a high floor of the apartment building. At first, it didn't even register in our minds. It took a few seconds for us to realize what we were actually seeing. It was a man who had jumped from one of the upper floors, around the 6th story of the building. The moment he hit the ground, the sound was incredibly loud. It was a heavy impact that seemed to stop everything around us. Even the noise of the street and the usual background sounds felt like they disappeared for a second. It is a sound I can still recall, even now. Not clearly, but enough that I never forgot it. For a moment, everyone nearby was frozen. No one knew what to do, especially us children. We were too shocked to even fully understand what had happened. The man was lying on the ground, and it was clear that the impact had caused very serious injuries. He was still alive for a short time after the fall. There were small signs of movement and sounds of distress, but it was obvious that the situation was extremely severe. It didn't last long. After a few minutes, everything became still. Adults quickly rushed to the scene, and someone called for emergency help. Very soon after that, police and ambulance services arrived. The area was quickly surrounded, and we were told to stay back. My friends and I stood there quietly, trying to understand what we had just witnessed, but it didn't make sense to us at that age. Even though so many years have passed since that day, I still remember it clearly. Not every detail, but the feeling of it. The shock, the confusion, and the strange silence that followed such a loud and sudden moment. It is something that never really leaves your memory once you see it as a child. Both of these experiences stayed with me in different ways. One happened while I was an adult working on a construction site, and the other when I was just a kid playing outside. In both cases, they were ordinary days that suddenly turned into moments I would never forget. They remind me how quickly life can change without warning, and how some images and sounds stay in your mind long after everything else fades. About 20 years ago, when I was around 9 or 10 years old, my home life was going through a very difficult period. My parents were in the middle of a divorce, and the atmosphere in the house was heavy almost all the time. There were constant arguments, tension, and a general sense of instability that I didn't fully understand at that age, but I definitely felt it. It made everyday life feel uncertain, like you never really knew what mood the house would be in from one hour to the next. We lived in a large, newly built 4-story house. It was modern, spacious, and had a basement where my father had his office set up. He had been working in it since the early 1980s, so even as a child I picked up a lot of interest and basic knowledge about computers from him. Because of that, I was already a bit more familiar with technology than most kids my age at the time. My father left for work early in the day and usually came back after 5 p.m., so his office in the basement was mostly unused during the daytime. Over time, that space became something like my own little testing ground. Whenever I had free time, I would go down there, sit at the computer, and explore things online. Back then, the internet was very different from what it is today, and I sometimes ended up on strange or unsettling websites without really thinking much about it at the time. One day, while I was alone in the basement doing exactly that, something happened that I still struggle to fully explain even now. I was sitting at the computer, completely focused on the screen. There was no sound playing, no video running in the background, nothing that should have produced any noise at all. The basement itself was quiet. There were no windows, thick insulated walls, and it was completely underground, so external sounds were minimal to almost non-existent. And then, suddenly, I heard something right next to my right ear. It was a sound that I can only describe as a strange, unnatural mix of a deep growl and a faint, almost mocking laugh. It wasn't distant or unclear. It felt extremely close, like it was happening directly beside me. It was so sharp and sudden that it almost felt physical, like I could feel a vibration against the side of my head and a small rush of air near my ear, similar to what you feel when someone whispers very closely. The most unsettling part was how real it felt in that moment. I know how computer audio works, and I can usually tell when a sound is coming from speakers or headphones versus something in the environment. But this didn't feel like it came from the computer at all. It felt completely external, even though there was no visible source for it. In that instant, my mind reacted before I even had time to think. It was pure instinct. I stood up and ran faster than I ever had before in my life. Everything about the situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, and my only thought was to get out of that basement immediately. After that, I avoided going down there alone for a long time. Even when I eventually did return, I never felt completely comfortable in that space again. I would always be alert, constantly looking around, and never fully focused the way I used to be before. It felt like something in my perception of that place had changed permanently after that moment. Interestingly, I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things in the house during that period. Our nannies also mentioned feeling uneasy at times or noticing things they couldn't fully explain. My younger brother, who was around 6 years old at the time, also had his own experience. One day, he came running downstairs from the 4th floor, crying and panicking, saying he had seen a tall black figure entering one of the small storage rooms in the play area. That floor was mostly used as a play space for us kids, and there were 2 small storage rooms on either side that were supposed to just hold toys and other items. They didn't connect to anything else and were just simple enclosed spaces, so his reaction really unsettled everyone. The second event that happened during that time involved both my brother and me directly. One night, while we were sleeping, we suddenly heard a bell ring inside our room. It was extremely clear and loud, and it woke both of us up at the exact same time. At first, we didn't think too much of it. We assumed it might have been one of our toys or something accidentally left in the room that made a sound. But then it happened again the next night. And then again. From that point onward, the bell would ring at a specific time every night. What made it even more disturbing was not just the sound itself, but the way we reacted to it. Every time it rang, both my brother and I would wake up instantly without any delay, as if something was triggering our awareness at that exact moment. It didn't matter how deeply we were sleeping or how tired we were. The reaction was immediate and consistent every single time. Eventually, my mother and grandmother also heard it. At first, they didn't fully believe us, but after hearing it themselves, they decided to stay in the room with us to try to understand what was happening. Even with multiple people present, the sound continued. We checked everything in the room. We removed toys, furniture, and anything that could possibly make noise. At one point, the room only had our mattresses left in it, and still, the sound continued at the same time each night. Later, after my parents' divorce, we moved to a new apartment about 200 kilometers away. For a while, things were normal again, and the bell stopped completely. But then, strangely enough, it started happening again in the new place under similar conditions. That part made the whole experience feel even more difficult to explain logically. Eventually, after a long period of repeated disturbance and uncertainty, my grandmother began praying regularly before the time the bell usually rang. After some time, the sound stopped again. This time, it didn't return for the rest of our stay there. Looking back now, many years later, I've tried to think through every possible explanation. I've considered technical causes, environmental factors, sound reflections, even the possibility of psychological influence during a very stressful time in the family. But none of the explanations fully match every detail of what we experienced. Especially the consistency of the timing and the shared reactions. Even today, just remembering that period brings back a strange feeling. Not just fear, but something deeper, like confusion mixed with discomfort. Whether there was a logical explanation or not, it was a very intense and unforgettable part of my childhood, especially during an already emotionally difficult time in my family life. A couple was riding their bikes along a frontage road in my town, and they were hit and killed in a tragic hit and run. It was one of those incidents that instantly changed the feeling of the whole community. Even if you didn't know them personally, you felt it. The kind of thing that makes people talk in low voices at stores, that makes everyone suddenly more alert when driving at night. It stayed in people's minds because it didn't just feel like an accident. It felt unfinished, like something open and unresolved. The investigation that followed didn't give many answers at first. That side of the road didn't have much coverage in terms of security cameras. The businesses along the frontage road couldn't capture what happened, but across the highway, there were a few late-night fast food places that had cameras pointed in the general direction. Those ended up being the only real source of footage. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't close enough to show everything in detail, but it gave investigators at least something to work with. From what people later heard through town conversations, the footage only showed a light-colored sedan in the area around the time it happened. There wasn't a clear license plate, no obvious identifying marks, nothing that immediately solved the case. It was just a vague piece of information that floated around for a while. Enough to keep people talking, but not enough to bring closure. After some time, the case started to fade into the background of daily life, like many unresolved things do in small towns. Life kept moving, even when something like that didn't feel fully resolved. About a year later, I found myself hearing about the incident again, but in a completely unexpected way. A friend of mine had matched with a guy on a dating app. It was one of those casual situations where you don't think much of it at first. She was just trying to meet new people and wasn't really expecting anything serious. Since it was going to be the first time she met him in person, she asked me to come along when they planned to hang out. She didn't want to be alone with someone she didn't really know, and in a small town where everyone is loosely connected, it felt normal to look out for each other like that. We arranged to meet, and I remember getting into his car when he arrived. It was a light-colored car, which didn't mean anything on its own, but it immediately reminded me of the only detail that had ever been mentioned in connection with that old hit-and-run case. At the time, I didn't say anything. I just noted it in my mind and tried not to let my imagination run too far ahead. People see thousands of similar cars every day, and coincidences like that are common, especially in a town where a lot of people drive similar vehicles. Still, something about him made me uneasy in a way I couldn't properly explain. It wasn't anything obvious or dramatic. He wasn't openly rude or aggressive, and nothing happened that I could point to as a clear warning sign. It was more of a feeling than anything concrete. The way he talked, the way he focused on certain details, the way the atmosphere in the car felt slightly off. It was subtle, the kind of discomfort you only really notice when you look back on it later rather than in the moment. We didn't end up seeing him again after that night, and life just moved on like it was a normal, forgettable experience. For a while, that was the end of it. Just a strange memory tied to an uncomfortable feeling that I didn't think much about. But about another year later, things came up again in a way I never expected. I was working at a hotel at the time, mostly with people I already knew through school or family connections. In a small town, workplaces often overlap socially, so it didn't feel unusual to be working alongside people who were already part of my wider circle. As the anniversary of the hit-and-run approached, the topic came up again in conversation. People in town sometimes remember dates like that, even if they try not to dwell on them. One of my coworkers, who was also a close family friend, mentioned that she had always felt a bit uneasy about someone she had previously worked with around that time. She wasn't someone who spoke lightly about things like that. She was straightforward, the type of person who didn't usually hesitate to say what she thought, even if it made conversations uncomfortable. She started connecting small details she had noticed back then. Things like the person calling in sick the day after the incident, or showing up to work shortly after in a different vehicle than the one he usually drove. In a small town environment, people tend to notice those kinds of changes, even if they don't immediately think anything of them. It's the kind of place where everyone knows what cars people usually drive, what their routines are like, and when something feels slightly different. She also mentioned something he had said at the time about his light-colored sedan. From what she remembered, he had told people that the car had been taken to a family friend who lived a few hours away after he supposedly hit a deer the night before the incident. He said he didn't want to take it to a shop and preferred to get it checked elsewhere. On its own, it sounded like a normal enough explanation, but in the context of everything people were starting to remember, it became one of several details that stood out in hindsight. At some point, she became curious enough to bring up the hit and run directly in conversation with him. It wasn't an accusation in a formal sense, just a direct question based on her own suspicions and the way she connected the details. According to what she later told us, he didn't respond in a way that clarified anything. Instead, shortly after that conversation, he left the job. He quit after that shift, and there wasn't much explanation given to anyone. I don't remember his name anymore, and I don't think most people in town talk about him now either. What I do remember clearly is seeing him in that moment at the hotel. especially the image of his face in the rearview mirror from that night I had been in his car. It's strange how certain details stick in your mind without you choosing them. Not the conversations, not the filled timeline, but small fragments like reflections, tones of voice, or the feeling of a moment that didn't sit right. Even with all the conversations and suspicions that circulated at the time, nothing ever came from it in a legal or official sense. The police had already been working with very limited evidence from the beginning, and by the time these later details were being talked about, years had already passed. There wasn't anything concrete enough to move forward with, and the case remained unresolved. Over time, it became one of those stories people in town mention occasionally, but without any new developments. Looking back on it now, what stands out most isn't any single event, but the way everything feels loosely connected in memory without ever forming a clear conclusion. A tragic incident that never fully got answers. A small detail about a light-colored car that stayed in people's minds. A brief encounter that left behind an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't explain at the time. And then later, conversations that made people revisit old memories and try to piece together patterns that might or might not have meant anything at all. Living in a small town does that to people sometimes. It makes stories overlap in ways that feel personal even when you're not directly involved. It also makes it hard to separate coincidence from meaning, because everything feels close enough to be connected. In the end, though, there was never a confirmed explanation. Only suspicion, memory, and the quiet weight of something that never reached closure. It was Thanksgiving when it happened. The kind of shift where everything feels slower than usual, even inside a pharmacy. The roads outside were quieter, most people were with their families, and the usual rush that fills a weekday just wasn't there. I was working at a pharmacy chain that I won't name, mostly doing normal counter duties, ringing people up, answering small questions, and passing time between customers. The store itself felt a bit empty that day. Not fully closed, but not busy either. The lights always felt a little too bright when there weren't many people around, and the silence between customers made you notice small things you normally wouldn't care about. Every footstep sounded louder. Every door chime felt more noticeable. That's when he walked in. He was a short man, wearing sunglasses even though we were indoors, which already stood out a little. He had a mustache and a kind of tired look about him, like someone who hadn't properly rested in a while. He was carrying a 3-ring binder under his arm, and it had a printed cover page that looked like it had been made at home. The image on it was low quality, like something printed from an old inkjet printer. It had a state flag on the front, but it didn't look official or professional in any real sense. It just looked personal, almost improvised. Along with the binder, he had a few small items in his hand. A can of Dr. Pepper, a can of Vienna sausages, and a pack of bandages. It was an odd combination. Not something you usually see someone buying together, but working in retail, you get used to strange combinations. People come in with random things all the time, and most of the time you don't question it too deeply. He placed everything on the counter, and I started scanning his items. He was quiet at first, just standing there, watching me work. The sunglasses made it hard to read his expression, which added a slight layer of discomfort, but nothing alarming enough to make me stop what I was doing. Then, while I was ringing him up, he mentioned casually that he had been stabbed recently. He said it in a way that didn't sound like he was trying to get attention. It sounded more like a fact, something he was just stating while waiting for his items to be scanned. He pointed slightly toward the bandages, like that explained everything. I remember pausing for a second, but not reacting strongly. In that kind of environment, you hear a lot of things that range from exaggerated to completely unexpected. Sometimes people joke, sometimes they overshare. and sometimes you just don't know how serious something really is. I assumed it was one of those situations where the injury wasn't severe, or maybe even something misunderstood. The area we were in wasn't the safest part of town, and we did get customers who were homeless, struggling, or dealing with mental health issues. So my mind just placed him into one of those categories without thinking too deeply about it. I finished scanning his items and told him the total. He paid without any issue, still calm, still speaking in that same flat tone. Then he asked if he could use the restroom to clean himself up and take care of his injury. I didn't see a reason to say no. It was a normal request, and we had a code for the restroom, so I gave it to him. As he walked away toward the back of the store, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. He had left the binder behind on the counter. At first, I thought he just forgot it. People leave bags and items all the time, and usually you just set them aside for when they come back. But something about it made me hesitate. I don't know why. Maybe it was the way it was placed so deliberately before. Or maybe it was just the strange feeling of the whole interaction not quite matching normal behavior. I stood there for a moment looking at it, telling myself I should probably just leave it alone. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my business. But curiosity is a strange thing, especially in a quiet moment when nothing else is happening around you. The store was empty, my supervisor was somewhere in the back, and the man was still in the restroom. Eventually, I did something I immediately wish I hadn't done. I opened the binder. The first page was a printed photograph. It showed a man, but not in a normal context. The image was disturbing, showing a body in a state that made it very clear the person had been dead for some time. It looked like it had been taken outdoors, and the condition of the image made it hard to process at first glance. It wasn't something you expect to see casually in a binder sitting on a pharmacy counter. For a moment, I just froze. My brain didn't fully register what I was looking at. It felt like my thoughts were lagging behind my eyes. I remember a sudden feeling of discomfort rising quickly, like my body realized something was wrong before my mind fully understood it. I closed the binder immediately. My hands actually moved faster than my thoughts at that point. I didn't look at any other pages. I didn't want to know what else was inside. I just shut it and stood there for a second trying to decide what to do next. Then, I went straight to the back to find my supervisor. I told them as calmly as I could that something strange had been left at the counter and that we needed to look at it. I didn't explain everything right away because I wasn't even sure how to explain it properly. It didn't feel like something you casually describe during a normal shift. My supervisor followed me back up front, and by the time we got there, I already had a bad feeling that something wasn't right. But when we reached the counter, the binder was gone. And so was the man. At first, we just stood there trying to process what had happened. There was no sign of him leaving normally. No obvious movement that I had noticed while going to the back. The restroom door area was out of sight from the front counter, and in a short span of time, he had managed to leave without drawing attention. We checked quickly, thinking maybe he had just taken the binder back and walked out, but there was no trace of him inside the store. No one had seen him exit clearly, and there was no interaction at the door that stood out. It was like he had come in, left his items behind for a moment, and then disappeared completely once he went out of sight. The rest of the shift felt different after that. Even though nothing physically dangerous had happened to me, the atmosphere of the store changed in my mind. Every time the door opened, I looked up a little faster. Every time someone walked in, I paid more attention than usual. I kept replaying the interaction over and over, trying to understand what was real and what I might have misunderstood. The strangest part wasn't even just the binder itself. It was how quickly everything shifted from a normal transaction to something that didn't make sense anymore. The calm way he spoke, The unusual items he brought, the injury he mentioned, and then the sudden disappearance. It all felt disconnected, like pieces of a situation that didn't fully fit together. Later, when I thought about it more, I realized how quickly I had tried to rationalize everything while it was happening. I had immediately placed him into a category that made sense for the environment we were in. Someone injured, possibly struggling, maybe unstable, but still just another customer. That assumption made everything feel normal long enough that I didn't question it until it was too late. Even now, what stays with me isn't just the image I saw for that brief moment, but the feeling of how quickly it all unfolded. The way an ordinary shift on a quiet holiday could shift into something confusing in just a few minutes. The way someone could walk in, say something unexpected, leave something behind, and then disappear without any clear explanation. After that day, I never really thought of shifts the same way again, not because something physically happened to me, but because it reminded me how little you sometimes understand about the brief moments you share with strangers. Most of the time, nothing comes from it. People come and go, and you forget about them by the end of the day. But sometimes, something sticks in your memory in a way you can't fully explain, even when nothing around it ever gets resolved. I've had a few experiences like that too. The first one happened a couple of years ago. I was up late gaming in my room when I suddenly heard shouting outside. At first, it didn't sound too unusual. In that area, it wasn't rare to hear people yelling at night, especially drunk arguments or random noise from the street. But this was different. It sounded more intense, more panicked, almost like someone was losing control of a situation. Right after that, I heard a heavy, dull thud. Not sharp, not metallic, just a deep impact sound like something or someone had hit the ground. It came from the side of the building where my skylight was. That mattered because my room layout was awkward. I had two windows on one side, but the skylight was on the other, facing the roof, so I couldn't just lean over and look down at what was happening. From the skylight, all I could see was the roof itself, nothing below street level. For a moment I considered getting up, but then I just didn't. I told myself it was probably nothing serious. People argue, things get thrown, noise happens in cities. It was easy to rationalize it and go back to my game, which is exactly what I did. A little later, I noticed flashing lights outside. A police car, maybe an ambulance. I've never been great at telling them apart at night in Germany. The light reflected off nearby buildings, and it looked like something serious was happening, but I still couldn't see the actual scene. I only had that partial view from my room. So again, I didn't think too deeply about it. I just assumed it was one of those typical late-night incidents that happen in any residential area. The next day, my mom mentioned something that changed how I thought about the whole thing. She told me there had been an incident in the neighboring house. Apparently, there had been a heated argument between a man and his girlfriend. At some point during the argument, he threatened to jump out of the window if she didn't stop yelling at him. And then, he actually did it. That dull sound I had heard earlier, the one I didn't think much about, was him hitting the ground. From what I later understood, he survived the fall since it was only from a relatively low floor. But the whole situation stayed with me, not because I saw it happen, but because I heard it without realizing what I was hearing. It's strange how your brain can completely disconnect a sound from its meaning in the moment, and only later reattach everything once you know the context. Even now, it makes me think about how many things we witness indirectly, without ever fully understanding them at the time. The second story is shorter, but it's one of those things that sticks because of how quickly everything changed. There was a town festival that my mom and I went to. It was one of those normal community events where everyone kind of knows everyone. or at least recognizes familiar faces. We met up with some friends there, and at one point I was introduced to a woman my aunt knew. She was a neighbor of my aunt, but I had never met her before that day. It was a casual introduction, nothing unusual, nothing that stood out, just a normal conversation in a crowded, loud festival setting. She seemed completely ordinary. There was nothing in her behavior or tone that would make you think anything was wrong. We spoke briefly, the kind of small talk you forget almost immediately afterward, and then everyone went on with their evening. A few hours later, I found out she had taken her own life in the basement of her building, in a room used for drying laundry. That information didn't feel real at first. It was hard to connect the person I had met earlier in the day with something like that happening so soon afterward. It creates this strange mental disconnect, where your memory of a normal interaction clashes with the knowledge of what followed just hours later. What stayed with me wasn't anything she said or did, but the timing of it, how someone can be part of a normal, everyday moment and then be gone shortly after. It makes you realize how limited our understanding of people really is, especially when we only see them in brief snapshots. The third story isn't creepy in a traditional sense, but it's one of those things that leaves a lasting mark because of how intense the moment was. It was another night where I was gaming, just sitting in my room with normal background noise from outside. At some point, I heard a car driving down the street. That itself was nothing unusual. But then there was a sudden impact sound, followed immediately by chaos. This time I could actually look out the window, since the sound came from the other side of the building. When I turned to look, I saw a police car stopped in the road. For a moment, it looked like they were just reacting to something unexpected, like they had come across a situation they weren't prepared for. Then, I heard a scream. It was one of the most painful sounds I've ever heard in my life. It wasn't just loud. It had this raw, distressing quality that immediately makes you feel uncomfortable just hearing it, even from a distance. That's when I realized a cat had been hit by a car. From where I was standing, I could see it trying to move. It was far enough away that I couldn't see details clearly, which was in some ways a small mercy. But I could still see enough to understand what was happening. Its back legs weren't responding properly, and it was dragging itself slightly, clearly in distress. The sound it made stayed with me more than anything visual ever could. What made the situation even more upsetting was the initial reaction of the police car. They drove off at first, which felt completely surreal in that moment. It was hard to understand why that would happen, especially in a situation where something clearly needed attention. It created this immediate feeling of frustration and disbelief, like something fundamental wasn't being handled the way you would expect. Eventually, they did come back. They checked the area, located the cat, and removed it from the road. After that, they left again. I don't know exactly what procedures were followed or whether someone else was contacted afterward, but from my perspective at the time, it felt abrupt and unresolved. What has stayed with me most from that night isn't even what I saw. It's the sound. That scream is something I don't think I'll ever fully forget. It's strange how certain moments imprint themselves so deeply, even when they are brief. All three of these experiences have something in common. None of them were fully understood in the moment. They were just fragments of events, sounds, glimpses, brief interactions that only later gained meaning once the context became clear. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all, how often real life doesn't announce itself clearly while it's happening, only afterward when it's too late to process it differently.